Hello, everyone. Welcome to our ninth episode of the podcast Tuesdays Against Executions. Today, it's a very great, we have a very great guest with us, who is Professor Eric Heinze. But before to introduce him, I would just to give you one additional data for this week of protest in relation to the week of protest. So this week, the prisons in Iran supporting the movement and going on with the movement Tuesdays Against the Executions are now 51. So this week, prison, the name is Langarud Prison of Qom, which is the 51 prison joining the movement. So you see that the movement is growing up increasingly, and we are proud to be the voice to amplify the voice of that movement. So it is my honor and pleasure to introduce today our host, Professor Eric Heinze, a professor of law and humanities and executive director of the Center for Law, Democracy and Society at the School of Law of Queen Mary University in London. It is just to summarize the intellectual work of professor, who is, including for me, for myself, an inspiration. And he wrote extensively on freedom of speech, on hate speech, prevention of hate speech, and his last book, I must confess publicly, I did it before to be connected, but I think I must assume publicly the responsibility, saying that it's a pending issue to me to read his last book, Coming Clean, The Rise of Critical Theory and the Future of the Left. Published last April 2025, right, Professor? So, but today he joined us to have an exchange of ideas about what is happening in Iran, and at the same time, why I don't want to use the term the West. Who knows me knows perfectly that I don't use this separation of identification of the globe unless it is used for a geographical issue, just for these reasons. So the central question today is to try to reflect with the help and the support of Professor Heinze, why outside Iran, in the so-called democracy in Europe, outside Europe, and in other kind of regimes in other regions of the globe, like Latin America, for example, there is not so much attention in relation to it. So why the situation of human rights abuse, the escalation of execution in Iran is not perceived, or it seems like not so interesting. So, Professor, first, point. What is one of the principal reasons, according to you?
Yeah, well, I I think you're right that there's probably not just one reason. There probably are several reasons, but I think among the most important would be the idea that the West uh, carries responsibility. All right. The common point of reference here, which I think many of your viewers will have heard many times, is the 1953 overthrow of the Mossadegh regime, right, of a democratically elected government in Iran, essentially by the CIA or with British and American cooperation. Um, so I think this is a reason commonly given, right? That in a sense, the West has no standing to challenge a regime which it was itself responsible for implementing. But of course, there are loads of problems with this idea,
Yeah,
right? Um,
yeah,
there are so many problems with it. I mean, I think the most obvious one is the very reason that we're here and that we're talking, which is that it's not a reason that any dissident that I've ever met thinks is really relevant. And of course, you know, the Middle East has been subject to colonial politics. Much of the world has been subject to colonial politics at an earlier era, in an earlier time. And I think people are often very selective about where they think history is ongoing and where they think it has made clean breaks, right?
yeah,
Uh,
yeah,
and you know, um, and so when so many dissidents themselves think that this 1953 event is just no longer relevant, it starts to look very artificial when it's often used and by so-called progressives, really. And in fact, this is quite interesting on that point. Sorry, I'm just going to make a little detour, right? Because I mean, I think one of the sad things here is that, I mean, if you ask progressives in the West, uh, they will never quite approve the Iranian regime, or very rarely. I can't think of anyone, right? So they'll always say, a bit like with Russia's invasion of Ukraine, they're always say, oh yes, it's terrible. We don't endorse that. We acknowledge it's oppressive and everything else, right? And then that's it. You get this kind of offhand acknowledgement, um, but it never goes any further, right? Whereas we've seen that there are many other causes where the progressives go much further, right? And I think the reason, and so it's very unclear what that acknowledgement is meant to achieve, right? And so to
yeah,
give a concrete example, a few years ago, I was invited by some Iranian dissidents to speak at a kind of a sub hearing in the British Parliament to try to speak with some members of Parliament about the ongoing campaign, the attempt to stop the executions, to recognize the 1988 massacres, and this sort of thing. Right? It was a very well-informed group of dissidents. They were very knowledgeable about their case. They came very well prepared. And actually, there were very, very few members of parliament who would call them, who we would tend to identify most as progressives, right? Now we can think of other issues where they would have piled in. And so, and this has been very much an ongoing theme for me. It's what exactly we mean by progressive in the
yeah.
21st century, and I think unfortunately this is a very sorry example. You would think that it means, well, listen, because progressives are constantly telling us we have to listen to the victims, but there's
Progressive
no.
means that you must stand on the side of people.
Yeah,
Doesn't matter the
yeah,
race, the
yeah,
sex, the gender, the
yeah,
orientation.
yeah,
Doesn't matter that. this is
Yeah,
really interesting
and also, it
because
shouldn't matter what happened, more than a half a century ago, presumably. That right? And so we can. I mean, there's no reason we can absolutely talk about the 1953 coup. Its implications for Iran, for the region, how it did indeed fuel what became the 1979 revolution. We don't need to hide this. Of course, we need to talk about it. And we need to think about it critically. But that's simply irrelevant to what Iranian dissidents are asking for today. And so, I can only I can only answer your question by asking again, why are Western progressives completely ignoring dissidents who would very much like their attention and would appreciate it? Why are they not lending the support when otherwise progressives seem to be so concerned about the region and seem to be so concerned about the Middle East, sometimes to the exclusion of any other region?
so thank you very much for that. I didn't sleep yesterday night thinking. I was so excited about that conversation because I do really hope that any progressive, also called self-defined progressive in Italy especially, is hearing us. Because you know that I'm Italian originally, and I used to repeat that progressive forces in my country of origin uh, don't exist, no longer exist. So they have a sort of facade, but that's it. So, and in the previous, actually, I don't remember exactly the episode, but I make a call into progressive forces all around the world, and especially my country of origin, uh, to saying you were created supposedly to guarantee social justice, to stand up on the side of people in need. Doesn't matter if the pain is not yours, it will become yours because you are the voice of the last one. That's the rule of progressive. But I think that, and I don't know what is your opinion about that. I think that we are increasingly living in an era where uh, there is a sort of confusion everywhere, perhaps more in some European country than in others, uh, about growth and progress. So I think that we made a sort of long way leaving behind a baggage of progress to the advantage of growth, economic growth, right? So, and what is even worse is that this is the process at the basis of the so-called left or progressive forces all around the world from my point of view. I don't know what you think.
Well, I think there's so many. I think there's so many points here that we've already accumulated. I actually just wanted to go back just before we continue. I wanted to go back to the very first comment that you made, which I should have acknowledged at the beginning, because I do agree with you that, talking about the West, which sometimes sounds essentializing, and it raises the question: well, the West, as opposed to what? The rest of the world, the East, what's that, and so forth, or the South and the North, right? And I agree with you that these are, very, very slippery terms. Often they mean very little. Often it would be more productive to talk about, autocracy versus democracy, or all sorts of other categories, right? So I agree with you. There's no fixed set of categories here, and there are no obvious cultural borders that we can draw neat lines around. So I absolutely agree with that. But and this, I'm just coming back to this now because I think it's so relevant to some of the discussion that we've already had, which is that in a sense, again, if we're interested in, well, what is the role of progressive thought here, and why have progressives essentially ignored Iran? Let's be honest. Again, we get the lip service, we get the occasional article in the Guardian, and but basically, I mean, certainly, I think you and I know from our university experience, this is off the agenda. Nobody talks about Iran, certainly not the so-called progressives, right? And so getting back to this comment about, well, what would we mean by the West, and is it even a useful category? I think the reason why we end up forced to use it is because progressives themselves use it as a reason not to engage on Iran. So I think this really links together a number of our points, right? Because you'll immediately, as we were saying before, you'll immediately hear, well, the West, has a certain responsibility, a certain guilt. The West was involved. The West was profiting. And of course, we hear this in many contexts, not only in the context of Iran.
Yeah.
And so in a sense, we end up forced, right? To use this polarizing concept of the West and the rest, right? Because it becomes used as I think very implausibly, as a reason not to engage. And again, particularly troublingly, when progressives have been so engaged in the Middle East and Middle East politics, how you can be a progressive, be engaged in Middle East politics, but then completely ignore Iranian dissidents, the Iranian dissident movement, what they're actually saying, what they're actually asking for, I think is incomprehensible, or to put it more bluntly, contradictory, hypocritical. It adds up to no ethics. It adds up to endless posturing and no ethics on the part of people who seem to have endless ethical lessons to teach the rest of us. And I think we even have to now, just to get back now to sorry, that was a long footnote, but just to get back now to to take a step further. What are Iranian dissidents asking for? They're asking for democracy. And this, you would think democracy would be the most self-evident concept for Western progressives, and yet it seems to cause endless problems, right? You won't find a single progressive in the West who says, I'm against democracy. Quite the contrary, they will say, we want more and better democracy, which is why they are often critics of existing democracies, and often rightfully so, right? Heaven knows that existing democracies have a lot to answer for. And again, these are things that need to be discussed. There's no need to deny that. And yet, if we look back over the past century, I don't think we can find a single year in which many, I'm not saying all, but many Western progressives were not supporting some deeply undemocratic regimes. I don't think we could find a single year right up to the present, from really, from essentially from Stalin to Chavez and beyond. And again, always saying, well, maybe we were wrong here, maybe we were wrong there, and yet one wonders what kind of lessons were really learned when right up to the present, this is still going on, whereas people who are asking for democracy are not listened to. Right? Lord knows that, right? When you and I were chatting online earlier, we were talking about Venezuela, and it's a perfect. How could it be that the people who massively support a de-democratizing regime in Venezuela will not support the democratic aspirations of Iranian dissidents. And then at the same time, they say that we want more and better democracy, right? Right? We're the true Democrats, right? It doesn't look like it. I can't, no Iranian dissident could believe a Western progressive, nor could any Venezuelan dissident believe a Western progressive. When they say we want more and better democracy, and yet they've spent the past 100 years, again, without interruption, support. Again, I'm not saying all of them, but too many, at least lending legitimacy to fundamentally undemocratic regimes, to the regimes that were preventing democracy or frontally dismantling democracy, and then want to come back to us to teach us about what real democracy is. And then don't listen to Iranian dissidents. This doesn't add up.
So, sorry to interrupt you, but there are a lot of points that I would like to pick. And because you mentioned, I start from the reference to the Venezuela situation and trying to be into the just last few hours. You know better than me that the escalation of the situation between Venezuela and United States is at least alarming from my point of view, because there is this kind of use of force instead to negotiate, or better said, the use to negotiate through the force, or the threat of the use of force, because we, for people who are hearing us and ignoring the latest events, I think we are at 4 my little vessel of United States just into the Panama line, or in international water, right, in front of Venezuela, better, right? And asking to the Venezuela government to stop the narco traffic. Officially, this is the reason. Unofficially, we can say that. We say that unofficially it is possibly related to the request of deportation of irregular migrant, or so-called irregular migrant, from United States to Venezuela, because at the same time of the arrival of the last vessel, also few Venezuelan non-legally residing in United States were received by the Maduro government. So this is, of course, my opinion. It is not just they are not the fact. It's an interpretation of fact. So, and this is the first point. The second one is in relation to the impact. What is, according to you, the impact that the nonsense, from my point of view, let me use that expression, nonsense of progressive forces all around the world, but especially in Europe and United States too, actually, how much it can impact also the development of a support by the public opinion to people of Iran, because the lack of support, the lack of interest, it is from one side visible into the progressive forces, but on the other side, there is also a lack of strong support by the public opinion, from my point of view. So this is these are the two questions for you. Thank you for answering.
Right. Yeah, well, I mean, you're kind of asking how we can promote greater public awareness, essentially, in the West in order to lend more attention and support to Iranian dissidents and to the Iranian opposition movement. Yeah, and I think here I see here we have quite a few problems. We can let's draw some other parallels, right? So we have this parallel to Venezuela, but let's try another parallel, right? So again, obviously, if there is a concern about the Middle East, right, we know that the number one concern, certainly nowadays, but actually for decades now, among so-called progressives has been Israel-Gaza. Of course, there are serious reasons why they would pay a lot of attention to, to Gaza, Israel, to the Palestine, and so forth. Of course, this needs attention. But there again, there are so many questions that come up, right? Again, if the concern is about democracy and human rights, why wouldn't that be a concern across the board? Why wouldn't that be a concern about the whole region, right? And so here again, it's often progressives who themselves insist on this concept of the West in a historical perspective, right? In other words, suggesting that, we have to inscribe all of these problems within long Western histories of colonialism, of racism, and so forth, right? Again, this 1953 example being only one of many. But again, progressives are often very, very unclear. Do we care about Western oppression or do we care about oppression? Right? Now, of course, right, if we care about oppression, then we have to care about Western oppression, right? But the idea that it's particularly progressive to focus on Western oppression. Again, we can all understand the impulse. Well, we shouldn't criticize others until we criticize ourselves. But, one of the things I've written in this book that came out earlier this year is that criticizing ourselves, this is one thing that progressives essentially think that they do. And in fact, I try to show example after example how, in fact, this is not something that progressives have been doing, right? We know, for example, that throughout the Middle East, there was often massive Soviet involvement, right? And often, at times when the Soviet Union had been receiving enormous amounts of support from Western progressives or from the Western left. Again, not uniformly, but to a large degree, right? Well, again, why wouldn't we also then be working a self-critical attitude about that support and about that history into our equation, which of course, yes, also has to take into account a criticism of Western power. I'm not saying that we should stop doing that. Of course, we need to do that. But we end up, right? So the people who are insisting that we need to do history are only ever doing about 50% of it. And so if we want to draw the parallel, say, to Israel-Palestine, right? We've heard in recent, months, these, of course, tragic stories about journalists being targeted, for example, in Gaza, right? And of course, targeting of journalists, right, beyond, the taking of life, right, has all sorts of implications about how the rest of the world is learning about his story, right? Yet one reason why Israel-Gaza or Israel-Palestine has always been so high on the agenda is that through much of its history, Israel, compared to its neighbors, has generally allowed journalists to come and operate and to do massive amounts of reporting, right? Over decades, there have been massive amounts of reporting, which is usually referred to by people who care about the Palestinians, unlike what Iran does. unlike what Iran does, right? One reason, right? So to get to your question about why is there not more public awareness, it's because journalists cannot operate freely, right? So yes, there's no doubt that it's tragic what's happened recently to journalists in Gaza, right? But the fact is that there's so much information about the plight of the Palestinians over decades because, generally speaking, journalists were free and have been free to operate throughout these territories in ways that they were not able to operate in Iran, right? But we can't let an explanation become an excuse because, again, as we know, there are many Iranians living in exile, right, throughout Europe, throughout the world. Many of them are all too eager to talk. Many of them are perfectly well informed. Many of them can tell us everything we need to know, right? And yes, every now and then, maybe one of them will get a voice on the BBC or CNN or wherever, right? But actually, it's not that much. So right, so this is a very long answer to your question, which is
No,
that
please.
yeah, right, well, right, which is that, well, one way to augment public consciousness is to improve coverage, is to improve media coverage, right? And right, in other words, if journalists simply say, oh, well, we can't operate in Iran, nothing to be done. No, you have to find, there are plenty of Iranian voices which are quite learned, quite authoritative, quite informed, right? You can't let this become a self-fulfilling prophecy. You can't do the work of the Iranian regime, right? By diminishing the reporting on the grounds that journalists are not free to operate there. The lack of freedom for journalists, for the media to operate in Iran, that should not be a reason not to cover Iran. It should be a reason to augment the coverage.
To augment, but the point is that they have no journalists have no access at all to the country to follow. But that's the point. I totally agree with you. Since the regime imposed no access to any journalist, doesn't matter from which country, they don't take in consideration the situation there because it's not
exactly. And so when Western so if the media just therefore stops reporting on Iran or reports much less, it's essentially doing the work of the Iranian regime.
Yeah, I do really hope because there is also, let me mention, because I just received today the message about the participation or not. Every year, Italy organized with the participation of the Minister of Foreign Affairs the Mediterranean dialogues. I had the chance to be there in 2019, just a year before the pandemic, in presence and then online. But let me say that this kind of a meeting, which is going to take place, which will take place next October, 15 and 16 October, never gave access to dissidents. Just official representative of the regime.
Yeah.
The ambassador, the permanent ambassador before international organization in Rome, for example, and so on. So this is the point, reflecting to that. If you want to have a dialogue on Mediterranean issue, on the situation of Iran, you must have the other part.
Yep, cool. Well, yeah, sure. And
at the moment, there is no change. There's no change, I guess, about. I hope that this year they will change their mind and they will invite also the resistance, the representative of resistance somewhere. Italy is full of dissidents too. They are disseminated in many countries, I guess. France, UK, not sure in Spain. There is not, I'm not sure there is a presence in Spain, an important presence in Spain, similar to France or UK or Italy. Anyway, it's just to add one more element to what you said, that the progressive, the so-called progressive forces in Europe don't make reference to the don't make reference to Iran, but also there's no sufficient attention paid by journalists to Iran because of the lack of the access to the territory. Sorry. But my question is, the other point I would love to fix with you is in relation to common people like me, right? I saw a sort of lack of indignation, you know. Marco Aurelio, the former Roman emperor, said that the best things to do is do it when nobody is looking at you. So it doesn't matter if they are looking at you. You must do what is correct. It's one of the father of the Stoicism, and why people don't care, simply don't care. Let me use that expression, simply don't care. So if I just make an example. If I go to the street here in Santiago de Compostela in the north of Spain, where I'm based, and I saw someone in need, I move faster, calling for the police and something. It depends. Why it doesn't happen in relation to Iran? I refer to common people. It is responsibility of the progressive forces, is because they don't care, so the public opinion don't care. What do you think?
Well, yes, and also, right, we've discussed the media, but then, we can't ignore, right, if we want to look at the kind of things that influence broader public opinion, also we can't ignore the role of our own profession, right, of higher education, of universities, right? And ask if, our universities, my God, in the last few years, we've seen, some of them seem to have nothing else on their mind than the Middle East, and yet they still manage to ignore Iran. Or let's be more precise about this. Let's be more precise. I think if you were to look over the past few decades at various universities, from time to time, right, you will have an event, a guest speaker, coming to talk about Iran. But then again, it will always be about the Western fault and the Western guilt. And again, fine, we should talk about those things. It's part of the history. We can't ignore it. But it's never drawn out to its conclusion. Right. If you're talking about Israel, Gaza, it's always drawn out to its conclusion, right? We have to boycott Israel. We have to divest in all of these other things, right? But with Iran, nothing, right? It's all about Western guilt, and that again, and so the logical conclusion is almost that the West shouldn't act. The West shouldn't do anything, because if it were to act, it would be hypocritical. It would be in denial about its own history, right? That doesn't follow. It doesn't follow logically, and it doesn't follow ethically. Rather, right, as we were saying at the beginning of our conversation, if the idea of progressives is that you listen to the victims, right? Well, there are plenty of Iranian dissidents who are saying exactly what they want, right? They want human rights. They want to get rid of an oppressive regime. They want a democracy. They want to be able to participate in civic life, in political life, and so forth. It shouldn't be too hard to understand. And so I think the question is not why Iran is ignored, but how it is ignored, how it ends up being ignored. If we ask why is it ignored, it's almost as if, well, it's just a kind of accident. It's just happenstance, but it's not. And so we shouldn't ask why, we should ask how. In fact, it's part of a whole technique, of what gets highlighted. To highlight a problem is always to sideline a problem, right? And the Middle East could be looked at very, very differently. But and the Middle East ends up being looked at so selectively. And again, on many sides, I don't only want to put the blame on progressives here. There's plenty of blame to go around right across the political spectrum. Let's be clear about that, right? And yet, here again, I have to come back to my first point. When I was invited to participate in this event in the British Parliament, again, by a very well organized, very thoughtful, very reflective group of Iranian dissidents. Again, they came with their notes, they came well prepared, they came with facts. One of the participants was my friend Javaid Rahman, who was the UN Special Rapporteur for Iran. Okay, so somebody also quite well informed. Why is it that none of the progressives, why is it that they had to turn to the Tories, the conservatives, right? Incidentally, that was when Corbyn was leader. I should be clear about that. The present government, the Starmer government, probably is more sympathetic to Iran, although they've had plenty of other problems, right? But when I was invited, this is when Corbyn, the supposed progressive, the supposed leftist was, basically we heard nothing. And Jeremy Corbyn was the one who was having a field day moderating a program on Press TV. Just a few months after, the Iranian authorities had massacred people in a demonstration, right? And he's the same one telling the rest of us to boycott Israel, and yet he was a guest on Iranian Press TV, this is state TV, essentially just pushing the state line, right? And so the Iranian dissidents, they end up having to go to the conservatives. They don't get anything progressive from the so-called progressives, nothing, zero. What they get is collaboration with the regime.
I think that, if I may, the idea I have, listening you about Corbyn, watching the present reform on migration made by so-called progressive in UK and so on, or thinking to the past, the so-called progressive in Italy having adopted the first limitation to access of so-called irregular migrants to the territory, and then now they are saying that there is the far right doing it. They started it. So that's the point. They failed inside the country. In UK, I think the so-called democratic forces in Italy, Democratic Party, five-star movements, if we can call five-star movements a progressive party. Let me use that expression because it's a kind of melting pot in some way. And let me just move the attention for 1 second apparently, at least from Iran to the last developed region of Europe, Calabria, in the south of Italy, is the end of the boat, which is going to have regional elections. So people is going to vote next October to elect the president of the local government, the regional government. So what is interesting is that in order to fight against not the far right, but the right, the coalition of right, on the other side, you find 12 parties, so different, including the new Communist Party, the five movement, the movement 5 Star, Democratic Party, Republican Action. So you see liberals, Democrats, a very example of melting pot at the local level. You see the difficulties to have to find the progressive forces there. And why I mentioned that? Because this is, to me, the clear example of the failure of progressive forces, as we already said, inside a given country.
Yeah.
In the case of Italy, in the case of Italy, in the case of UK. So if a progressive force is failing or failed, better said, inside the country, how it can take care outside, the exigencies coming from outside.
Yeah, absolutely, 100%. Yeah, yeah.
And,
yeah, no, yeah. Sorry, go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah, please.
Yeah, no, I mean, I can only agree with you. And it's also why I think we see analogies to what you're to the situation that you've just described in Calabria. I think that what you're saying actually explains why it's so difficult to mobilize opposition against Donald Trump, right? What is the single worst thing about Donald Trump? Well, it's hard to say because the list would be so long, right? You don't know where to begin. But if I had to choose one thing, it would be, the erosion, the hollowing out, every day hacking away at democratic values, norms, institutions. Now, how can we see progressives as the opposition to this when, as I said before, for the past 100 years, progressives, not all of them, but too many of them, have always been willing to support regimes that were hollowing out democracy, that were eroding democracy? How is it that suddenly we can turn to them as the ones who are going to put up an opposition to someone who's doing the same thing that everyone from Lenin and Stalin right through to Chavez and Maduro have been doing? Right? Yeah. What are their credentials? And so I agree with you. The trouble largely begins at home. And I agree with you that, yeah, we unfortunately, sadly, we can't be surprised that people are quite lukewarm, that so-called progressives are quite lukewarm about Iran. I mean, how many progressives were involved in challenging Chinese domination over Hong Kong? Right? Remember the umbrella movement in Hong Kong, right? When the people of Hong Kong, they wanted to keep their democratic institutions as had originally been agreed, right? When Britain pulled out of Hong Kong, right? The understanding was that Hong Kong, it would be one so-called one country, two systems, right? In Hong Kong, what they wanted were human rights and democracy. No progressives were interested. And Iranian dissidents are asking the same thing. And very few progressives are interested. Or if they are, they're not great at showing it, and certainly not great at mobilizing, which is always the litmus test for a progressive. The litmus test for a progressive is not that you just, casually acknowledge a problem in a seminar room, but that you mobilize. And so I think, where you and I can certainly agree is, where is the mobilization?
In Italy, who mobilized, there was a change. Firstly, into, let me say, early 2000s, maybe. Early 2000s, the substituting force mobilizing people in the squares for internal affairs, not for external ones, were Lega Norte, the League of North, Lega Nord. Yeah. So it is crazy because a sectarian party became the unifying party on the territory at that time. And you can easily find a video of their presence in the squares and people acting with the arm like it is a party, a progressive party, but it isn't. So, and then secondly, now who unfortunately is capitalizing the need of people and the mobilization of people is the social right. The social right,
Sure.
the social part of the extreme right.
Sure. Yeah, sure. Like the Rassemblement National in France.
Exactly.
Sure.
Exactly.
Sure.
This is the point.
Yeah.
So, and people don't see the difference.
Yeah.
They just are people in need.
Yeah.
I was completely shocked in relation to Italy, for example, when I saw the difference of people after the pandemic. We had a lot of trouble everywhere.
Yeah.
So then, if you ask for support, they don't answer. They simply don't care because they are tired. And I think that this situation of it is too much all around the world is a sort of diffuse condition. And this implies that the situation of Iran is still far to be central in many debates at national level.
Yeah. Another analogy, would be to Ukraine.
Yeah, exactly.
You get, anybody can condemn Russia. That's easy. But what comes next? Right? And there again, it's incredible. I mean, the parallel between Ukraine and Iran is astounding, because when the Ukraine war broke out, again, I wrote about this in my book. When the Ukraine war broke out, it's amazing how many progressives were blaming it all on the West. Right? And yes, there was a Western history there. We can talk about things that NATO has done. Again, I believe in talking about all of this, right? But this unbelievably reductionist history, again, in Iran, we're going to reduce it all to 1953, right? The Soviet Union, we're going to reduce it all to, a so-called NATO expansion, which itself, would require actually much more discussion. And once again, just as progressives don't listen to Iranian dissidents, they haven't been listening to Ukrainians. So yes, you find some progressives who will condemn Russia more or less, and it never goes any further. It never goes any further, right? No mobilization, right? And so, yeah, I think the real theme of our conversation this evening has been, what does progressive mean?
Yeah,
What does
I
it
know
mean in
what
the
it means.
West? You know, in the West, which has set much store by the notion of progress and the progressive.
Let me, if I may, don't mind me, please. I think that both we know, you and I, what it means for us. Because the fact that you accepted this invitation and you are kindly offering your time, your views, joining us today, it's one more evidence that what be progressive means, right? So, and from my side, perhaps it's easier to me because a good friend of mine used to say that I'm the last Bertinian. So the last follow of President Sandro Pertini of Italy, the last socialist, the last Italian socialist. In fact, no, not so many knows know who was, but President Pertini was the president of the Republic, unique one, uh, coming from the anti-fascist resistance. It was one of the leader of the resistance, and it seems it is not certified, but it seems who gave the order to execute Mussolini. So that's why I say to me it's easier because my this friend of mine used to say that I'm the last Bertinian, so the last follow, but the last follow of the president, uh, who was the father of the indignation, I guess. And I would like to use this reference first to say to people of Iran, to people of Iranian prisons and their family, that this is, if it's possible, one more evidence that I will never let you alone. Never. Never. Your suffers, your sorrow is mine. And it is my duty to stand up uh, by your side, and privilege at a certain point, because not everyone has the value and the force. And well, my shoulders are not so big actually. I'm trying to make them biggest. But this is our role. This is our role, and I think, Professor, that I can say the same about you. Let me presume, at least I can say the same, even I don't know you directly. But this is why I'm so happy to have you today. So, but I don't want to abuse of your time, because if it depends from me, you can stay here all the day and have a conversation the day after day, you know, because it's just to give the idea to you firstly, and then to the public. Today is like when you give a candy to a kid to a little boy, a little girl of 4 years old. It's the same status I am today. I think I cannot be more clear about. So before to leave, I would like to ask you, because we used to ask to our guests to send a direct message to people of Iran, to people in prisons and behind the movement. So please.
And I don't think I can improve on your message, which you put so beautifully. except to add, don't lose faith, don't give up. And
Yeah,
there are a few of us here in the West who do believe in this cause.
yeah. Where actually we are located geographically in the West, but we are global citizens, we can say, Professor Bennett.
Hopefully.
Yeah, because after all, using geographical indication not to identify good things, like in the case of using West and East and South and North, and South and North, um, is, I think, it's a form of new colonization
Mm-hmm.
through the language. So that's why I don't really like to use global south, global north, global. I'm horrified anytime I hear global south. I'm from the global south. Me too. I'm from the global south. I'm from the last developed region in Europe, Calabria. I'm a woman. I'm a woman with. I'm the first director of football match in Italy 27 years ago. So imagine the disaster, the tragedy in the south of Italy. I had no access to higher education and to a PhD easier because I'm from the south. I didn't have access to specialize myself on human rights at that time. So I know what it means be from global south and be discriminated because from the global south. So global south doesn't exist. It's always a matter of discrimination, of persecution, like in the case of people of Iran.
Yeah.
And let me use that phrase, that beautiful phrase, sentence uh, used by the by the in another context, of course. But I think it's ideally resume it ideally resume the what humanity is. So the Inter-American Court of Human Rights recently in the advisory opinion on climate change uh, said in a sentence that something like humanity is a legal and moral community. It's a unique, united, legal and moral community, humanity. We all are members of humanity. Doesn't matter religion, geographical indication, nationality, and if you are progressive or not, and so on, the sexual orientation. And I put the accent about sexual orientation because this is another point we need to, I hope we have in the future the opportunity to discuss about the rights of people of Iran, LGBTQ plus in Iran. So, but this is for next episode in the future. So, Professor, thank you very much to be with us today for your time, and I hope to meet you in person soon. I
Yes.
promise I have a pending issue, and after today, more than ever, to read the book, the last book, the latest book. So, thank you again, and see you. Thank you to the public, and see you next Tuesday.
Thank you very much. And, again, our thoughts and our best wishes with all of the people of Iran, and above all with the dissident movement and with the opposition movement, which is trying to bring about a better life.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you very much. Thank you
Thank
very much,
you.
Professor.
Thank you.